Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I'm joined today by Kevin Oakes. Kevin, can you please introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Gleb. As as you said, my name is Kevin Oakes. I'm the CEO and co-founder of an organization called the Institute for Corporate Productivity, and we shorten that to I4CP. We're one of the leading HR research firms in the world. We have been conducting research for decades. We used to be called the Human Resource Institute, but we relaunched over 15 years ago as I4CP. And our research is always focused on the people practices of high-performing organizations.
Mhm.
We're always tying HR back to bottom line business impact. So we look at organizations that have better revenue growth, market share, profitability, et cetera, and look at the differences in their people practices versus low-performing organizations. And while we come up with a lot of best practices, we really hang our hat on the concept of next practices, where we can see a strong correlation to business impact, but not a lot of companies have yet put that practice into place. And beyond the research, we have a very large peer network of tens of thousands of HR executives around the world that we leverage day-to-day practical, tactical insights to and try to make that strategic research come to life.
Excellent, Kevin. Now, tell me a little bit about your new report, the Future Ready report, where I presume you want to focus on those next practices and what leaders are doing, but not everyone has put them into place yet.
We traditionally have done a lot of work on organizational culture. It's
Mhm.
certainly a favorite of mine. A few years ago, we did a big research study on culture change called
Mhm.
culture renovation. And we looked at a number of companies who tried to change their culture. We had over 7,000 participants in this particular study. Most companies who try to change their culture fail. Most fail miserably. And we found that a small percentage succeeded. And so
Hmm.
we were very curious about the ones who succeeded. We wondered if there was some kind of blueprint that could be shared with others on what works if you are trying to create a healthier, more agile culture overall.
Mhm.
And we found that, and it eventually became a book by that name, Culture Renovation,
Mhm.
where we highlight 18 action steps that organizations can take to create an unshakable organization. From that, we've continued to do research on what creates a healthy culture inside an organization.
Mhm.
And going back to my agile description, how do you create a culture that is ready for the future? And so our latest study looked at agile and future ready cultures, which I think a lot of CEOs and senior leadership teams are looking for. As we
Mhm.
go into unpredictable times, it seems like it gets more and more unpredictable.
Sure.
That's what you really want. You want a culture that doesn't fear change or look at change as a nuisance and wishes things doesn't wouldn't change because it's going to change. You want a culture that instead looks at change not only as normal, but one that embraces change and looks at change as an opportunity. And so our latest study was really looking at those agile cultures and what does it take to
Mhm.
create a future-ready culture going forward. There's tremendous benefits to doing that. We found that companies with those healthy, future-ready cultures, they're 5 times more likely to be a high-performance organization, meaning they have better revenue growth, profitability,
Hmm.
market share than their competition. So there's a direct link between the health of the culture and how that company does financially, and we highlight that quite a bit in this new study.
Mhm. So let's talk about that. So, what specific actions should companies take to be future ready, to be comfortable being agile, while, of course, knowing what they're best at and not having scope creep and kind of going in all new directions, being too unanchored to the past? What is the best practice there or next practice there?
Yeah, first, let me talk a little bit about the advantages of a healthy culture. What we
Yeah.
found with those healthy cultures, they are 5 times more likely to have better employee productivity,
Hmm.
twice as likely to have a diverse employee population, 4 times as likely to have better engagement and
Mhm.
well-being in the organization, as well as being better at innovation. And some of the outcomes of that is they're 5 times more likely to retain and attract their top talent. And
Mhm.
so to get there, there's a number of things that organizations are doing to create more trust across the organization.
Mm.
And what we found was that the core principles, there are really 3 core principles of a future-ready culture. The first one is that they're employee focused, and that means they
Mm.
focus on employee growth
Mhm.
and career opportunities for those employees. In fact, one of the practices that we found many of these companies share is in the performance management process, they're measuring people leaders on their ability to grow employees, on those employee
Mm.
outcomes, as opposed to
Mhm.
just business outcomes. And there's a
Mm.
lot of companies that they're measuring managers purely on business outcomes, but if
Mhm.
you don't
Sure.
weave in those employee outcomes, then the culture can suffer as a result of that. The other is being a learning-centered culture. That's all part of being
Mhm.
employee-focused. If you have a culture that is defined by people who actively share knowledge, or as Satya Nadella at Microsoft says, a learn-it-all culture versus a know-it-all culture, you're
Mm.
generally going to have a healthy culture.
Mhm.
The second core principle was being mission driven, just having
Okay.
North Star clarity on, what's your mission, what's your purpose, and having the leaders really walk the talk and exhibit the
Mhm.
values of the organization. Those tend to be healthier cultures. And then the third is what I mentioned earlier, just being change ready, having that fluidity of mindset and collaboration across the workforce, that when change comes, you embrace it. You see it as an
Mhm.
opportunity, not as something that you should walk away from.
I want to talk about that last one. So let's talk a little bit about change and exploration versus exploitation. So a number
Yeah.
of companies like to develop SOPs, standard operating procedures, and stick to them. And there's definitely benefit to that because when you have standard operating procedures, you make sure that you get the current, what really works, you share that across the organization and you get everyone doing it. But the challenge with, and that's the exploitation. So you exploit what you know best. Of
Yep.
course, that impedes exploration, where when the situation changes, the standard operating procedures impede you from adapting quickly to that change. So, where do you draw a balance between exploration and exploitation? And what is actually
Yep.
productive now and what is going to be productive in the future, but is less productive now?
Yeah, and you use the right word, balance. I think there is a fine line between having good governance around what you're doing as an organization, and
Mhm.
having some of those policies, but not being too beholden to them. So
Mm.
in some ways, it's almost easier to look at change averse cultures when you're talking about what are some of the best ways a company can embrace change. And when
Mhm.
we see a change averse culture, they also have some core symptoms. One of them
Mhm.
is being a by the book kind of culture where
Mhm.
you have excessive hierarchy in the organization and don't let people jump the hierarchy or cross
Mhm.
lines when collaborating or when making decisions, but also rewarding rule followers versus those who are innovative and those who can
Mhm.
really execute inside the organization. You'll often hear the phrase, well, that's the way we've always done it
Mhm.
in those kind of companies. And I think that change ready culture is it's equally important to look at what are some of the traits of a change averse culture.
Mhm.
And we find that like we were just talking about, Gleb, many organizations that have excessive hierarchy are what we call by the book cultures,
Mhm.
where they tend to reward the process more than people who are innovating and executing.
Mhm.
You often hear that's the way we've always done it inside those organizations. And they tend to have those hierarchies where you can't jump the hierarchy, you can't communicate across lines, et cetera. And so those tend to be very change averse and
Mhm.
slow, non-agile cultures. But a couple other core symptoms that we see are cultures where you have a me versus we mentality. And
Mhm.
these are often toxic cultures that
Mhm.
are characterized by excessively individually focused incentives, kind of like what I
Mhm.
was saying earlier in Microsoft, a know-it-all attitude versus a learn-it-all attitude. They can be disrespectful, internally, and oftentimes the end justifies the means, meaning we're celebrating these brilliant jerks who get things accomplished, but just leave a
Mhm.
trail of destruction in their wake. And that can be very tough on the culture itself,
Mhm.
and very, that's usually a change averse culture. And then the third one is kind of the opposite of that. It's cultures that we call them content and complacent. But these are
Mhm.
cultures where you tend to have more decisions made that are overly inclusive. It's sort of a risk averse culture, and let's get
Yeah.
everybody's opinion before we, make a decision. And that can often be the result of a culture that does not have psychological safety to express opinions.
Mhm.
You find oftentimes in these cultures, there's the meeting after the meeting where people
Mhm.
don't feel safe to say what they feel in the meeting itself, but whisper their true opinion after the
Yeah.
meeting. Those cultures also tend to be, very change averse cultures. And so you can see where the opposite of all those are cultures that, tend to embrace change more quickly.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's funny that you mentioned that the over-inclusiveness. I was going to ask you that as my next question. Right now, working with a client that used to have a culture that was what I would call over-inclusive. So they have a senior executive leader and then an 8 people senior management team, like the C-suite, under him. And previously, the decision making was taking place among that team, among on all relevant issues. Now, what I did when I started working with them in terms of restructuring that is to create task forces where specific subgroups, including a couple of members of the C-suite, 1 or 2 or 3, and some people below the C-suite would be involved in making specific decisions. And so right now, we're actually in the middle of one of those where I'm facilitating them hiring a new marketing director, a new CMO. And I've just gotten an email from someone who is not on the team complaining that he felt he wasn't included enough, like he's head of sales, head of business development. He felt like he wasn't included enough in the process of hiring, but he wasn't on the task force. And we decided with him, his participation, that he shouldn't be on the task force. And so now there's kind of complaints about not inclusive enough, but I'm like, okay, you weren't at the meeting. You could have been. It was open to you, but you chose not to be in the task force. And now we're proceeding with a hire. He is one of the people who's evaluating the hire, but not one
Yeah.
who has thought through all the elements of the job position and the criteria and the considerations. So with that sort of situation, how do you balance when you're changing a team, a culture that's been too over-inclusive to one that is trying to go to where it's not taking up everybody's time, where you don't have to consult everyone, but where now people feel like, oh, I used to be consulted, but now I'm not so consulted anymore, and they feel upset about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues there. I think some of this has to come from the top, and I think
Mhm.
leadership has to emulate what they want the rest of the employees to be doing inside the organization. I don't know how large the organization is you're talking about, but it's the more you can push decision-making authority down, the more nimble you're going to be as a
Mhm.
company. But you've got to trust that the people you're pushing it down to are making the right decisions, right? So,
Yeah.
I think if you have a little bit more tolerance for mistakes,
Mhm.
where you use mistakes as learning opportunities,
Mhm.
it can be very beneficial. I know a lot of companies, they will often celebrate mistakes as a learning
Yeah.
opportunity and talk about that. And that will create more of an atmosphere where people aren't afraid to make decisions, and where senior leaders are more comfortable pushing those decisions down, to others in the organization. Sometimes
Mhm.
it takes more formal charts, a RACI chart or something
Yep.
to, show what kind of decisions should bubble up and what kind of decisions should be made at certain levels. All of that is very healthy in an organization, particularly if an organization is growing. You have to go through some of those growing
Mhm.
pains, right?
Yep.
When you're smaller, things tend to get made, decisions tend to get made at the top. As you grow, you have to push that down if you're going to scale as an organization.
Yep, and exactly. It's an organization that's scaling and they have still, but their decision-making process hasn't caught up with their scaling. And RACI, the responsible, accountable, consulted included for folks who don't know about it. Yeah, that's definitely one of the modalities that I've included there.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Now, as we finish up, are there any last words that you wish to share about this report or your work more broadly?
Only, it's funny, you and I share a common interest in looking at return to office and
Hmm.
the difference between hybrid and remote or flexible work. I'm often seeing, as most companies have some sort of return to office edict, the reasons given is because we want to improve productivity or we
Hmm.
want to improve collaboration or even innovation. If you really want to improve those things, first and foremost, focus on the culture.
Yeah.
A healthy culture is going to have much more impact on innovation, on productivity, on collaboration, even on the bottom line financials of the organization than where an individual sits, and gets their work done. So, then my one piece of advice to any senior leader listening to this is, try to make that link between a healthy culture and the performance of the organization. That's going to have the biggest impact overall.
Absolutely. And if you don't trust your people to know and decide for themselves when it's best for them to come in, that doesn't create a good culture.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise, Kevin. That was very helpful.
No worries. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show and helps us improve the show.